Okay, so welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides, and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, Ray Laurence, is Professor of Ancient History at Macquarie University. His research focuses on Roman social archaeology and history, mainly urbanism, the Roman family, and Roman roads. He is author of numerous books, most recently Mediterranean Timescapes, Chronological Age and Cultural Practices in the Roman Empire, published with Routledge in 2023, as well as collaborating with Mary Harlow on such publications as Age and Aging in the Roman Empire, the Cultural History of Childhood and Family Antiquity, and the Cultural History of Shopping in Antiquity, and the last two published by Bloomsbury. Ray also makes animated films, such as Four Sisters in Ancient Rome, which was viewed more than 20 million times on YouTube. I can see our YouTube channel has some work to do to get into the same league. And is the founder of Ancient Rome in Motion, with 5 films on Pompeii produced to support the study of ancient history in high schools. He is currently editing The Cultural History of Transport and Mobility in Antiquity. His paper today stems from the latter and is titled Mobility in the Ancient World, an Emerging Multi-Species Perspective. Over to you.
Okay, so where?
Sorry, let me
technical difficulty
up here and
Okay. Okay, so where are we actually coming from? Now, many years ago, I published a book in the last millennium by a year called The Roads of Roman Italy, Mobility and Cultural Change. Now, the thesis of that book was that the Roman Empire happened because there was a change in mobility. So we're linking back to things from long ago. And Sasha just said that I do quite a lot of work on the city. So these are the two things. The current book project is called The Cultural History of Transport and Mobility. The manuscript is with the editor of the 6 volumes, who has said absolutely nothing since we sent it to him, presumably because the other 5 volumes aren't ready yet. But you can see that things like there are titles like Moving Bodies, which I tried to get someone to write about, and everyone said no. And so I decided to do it myself. So that's probably where it's coming from, more than anything else, this paper. So this is where we're coming from. Now, quick outline of the paper. There will be some audience participation. You get a question in a moment. So in terms of what's happening at the moment is the study of ancient DNA of animals is actually reshaping our knowledge of human-animal relations. And the other thing which has been there's an article in the journal Antiquity from within the last 5 years about the domestication of animals and agency, and particularly giving animals agency in their own domestication. So this is quite an interesting thing of itself. And so domestication of animals is the big thing, which is a bit earlier than the sort of bit of antiquity, let's say in the last millennium BCE, first millennium CE that we're interested in mainly, but it does affect things. So the other thing, domestication doesn't cause the spread of donkeys, camels, etc. To the Western Mediterranean. It's not some instant process. Domestication is quite often from one pair of animals. It's actually it's traced back to not very many animals being domesticated, and then their descendants are there. The other thing, which is we're looking for sort of proxy evidence of changes in mobility. Now, it's possible that we could say the big archaeological sites are indications of changes in mobility. If we think of Mycenae, Pompeii, where we actually see quite a lot of change in the scale of buildings. So is this about a reflection of the capacity for mobility? Right, so we'll get some real evidence shortly. So we start with Homer, which is an extraordinary place for me to even be in. There's great insecurity about Homer. We go to Assyria, another place where I'm not familiar with, and then on to Rome, because in many ways I'm working back from the knowledge which I have in my nice book from the last millennium about Roman roads in Italy, which is my safe place, which has a chapter about mules and muleteers in it. And the interesting thing about the Roman period is all animals get larger and physically larger. Pigs get larger, they have more girth, cows get larger, and they're very good at mule breeding. So if we're thinking about multi-species antiquity, I'm just picking this one up because the Battle of Actium is such a moment when every course seems to have it. Octavian was going down to his fleet to engage the enemy. He was met by a donkey and a chap driving it. Now, this causes him to actually set up a statue to the donkey and also to the man, because the man's called Eutychus or Fortunate and the animal is called Nikon. So we have a clear idea. I have no idea how time could be going. I just say this because I haven't got a watch.
I will.
Okay, you'll keep an eye on the time.
Keep an eye on the time.
Because we could do this too fast or too slowly.
7 minutes in.
Okay, all right, we've done. So this is the point of audience participation. The Pyramid of Giza is dated to 2500 BCE. Who thinks the dromedary, I mean, you see this camel pyramid thing all the time. Everybody takes pictures of. I have a picture sent to me by Tom Hillard, of a young Tom Hillard with his mother on a camel next to this pyramid. Now, the Pyramid of Giza is 2500 BCE. My question for you, was the dromedary domesticated before or after this date?
I would say after.
After?
I would have said before until you asked the question.
The question is right. So Ryan's read the question. And Tanika, you're here as well?
I'm terrified of providing an answer. I feel like I'm going to split the room. I have no idea.
Well, we've got Rebecca as well. Rebecca, do you want to have a guess?
I'm thinking after.
Okay, the answer is after. And what's even more surprising is the distance afterwards. So 1200 BCE, the dromedary is domesticated. So that is kind of astounding. So all our poor Egyptologists and the period that they're really interested in know camels. I just found that phenomenal. I knew nothing about this until I had to write a chapter on moving bodies. So one of the things, genomes and history, a lot of the writing about genomes and human history can be very, very human orientated. So human history is marked with efforts for overcoming obstacles, be they geographic, mountains, seas and deserts, or cultural nature. Domestic animals, and in particular camels, we're going to have more camels later, have been linked to this process of human development and were essential for its success. Now, and this person's writing very much so about human success rather than human animal success. Now, one of the great things about the dromedary deciding to be domesticated, the end result in Australia is we have the largest wild camel population in the world. So that is an outcome of domestication, which is completely unintended and probably isn't for human well-being. Now, the donkey, just so that we can get our chronology of donkeys roughly right, 500 BCE, there are unique African sources. Now, spreads into Eurasia, but we don't, less clear how far by 2500 BCE, roughly the time of the Pyramid of Giza, and there's a differentiation. Now, this study, which is a phenomenal study involving about 50 authors, has actually quite relatively few examples, but we see in Tarquinia in Italy, 800 to 500 BCE, they've got examples. Marseille, 0 to 200 CE, northern France, 200 to 400 CE, tend to be where it gives us sort of specimen examples. So they're different, very clearly different dates, but the key problem is archaeologists have been pretty negligent in the past about animal bones. They've just not seen them as really interesting. The animal bones from Pompeii, there is a study by a Japanese team who kept the animal bones in the 1990s excavations, who was seen as a bit odd for keeping. It hasn't, I don't think it's out yet, but it will be the first big study of animal bones from Pompeii. There isn't one at the moment, which seems slightly negligent. Now, in terms of human-donkey relations, the Brooke action for working horses and donkeys, donkeys are actually increasing in the modern world. They are threatened by a trade in donkey skins, where people just go and take your donkey, skin it, and send the skin to China. But this gives you an example of sort of the power and the moving capacity. So this guy says, well, before we got educated, we used to take 7 times a day, 3 to 5 kilometers for each round trip, approximately 80 to 30 kilometers, traveling per day, carrying 50 to 60 kilos of stone. Now, this is sort of the sort of pack animal. Now, pack animals, if you're thinking about sort of the economies of carts and things, people always think about carts and the Roman economy. But if you see the picture there, there is one guy driving about 8 donkeys with 50 kilos each. Whereas if he was in the cart, he would not be able to drive more than 1 cart. You probably need 2 people for the cart. So it's actually quite an efficient thing. Just sort of thinking this idea of pack animals is incredibly important for the ancient world. Now, mules are a cross between a donkey and a horse, a female horse, and it produces something which is stronger than a horse in terms of strength and something with more endurance than a horse, and they live roughly double the length of time to 25 years. So this is the sort of classic improved breed. If you were a Roman proconsul going to your province, you would go off with your carriage drawn by matching mules. And those mules would cost lots of money. So this is very much so elite status. I read in a commentary on one of the texts, which was sort of talking about humble mules. Mules are not humble in the ancient world. They're actually quite high status. And this is where we launch into places where Ray should not really be. Right, mules in the Iliad. There are lots of references to mules in the Iliad. And they're actually really, the most interesting one is the top one, in my opinion. Dolon suspected nothing and soon passed them, but when he had got about as far as the distance by which a mule ploughed a furrow. Now, isn't that a weird thing for an epic poem to be talking about? It's actually giving you details about ploughing by mules and oxen. It is so weird. Well, I read it. Well, it's actually, because I was thinking, we're going to go and look at, yeah, it's that literature thing, it won't be helpful. But this is really helpful because it talks about mules ploughing more quickly than oxen. And whatever date you want to put on the Iliad, let's say it's 8th century BCE for sake of argument. The other thing which we have lots of prizes of mules. So for skill in painful art of boxing, he brought out a strong mule, made it fast in the middle of the crowd. A she mule which had never been broken. Never being broken is also seen as a quality. The next one, he laid his hand on the mule and said, let the man who is to have the cup come hither, for none but myself will take the mule. I am the best boxer. Another one, the second, he appointed a mare of 6 years unbroken with a mule foal in her womb. These are prizes. These are elite prizes. And we can find some more. And I think we've got another mule of 6 years. And so it goes on. So mule, yoke, etc. And when we come to the return of Hector's body, Priam has his mule-drawn wagon. Now, this is sort of classic because it says that the wagon is bigger. So to put the treasure on to get Hector's body back, and that emphasis on mules. Now, this gives us a dating point. So in terms of proxy evidence, we have a dating point where very definitely Greek world has mules, but they seem to be of high status. So they seem to be there's a rarity to them potentially from what we're looking at. So it's not something which we could say that, yep, there were mules everywhere, but they know about ploughing with mule. And if we look to the Odyssey, we can find some more references to mules, including. And in Works and Days, they talk about the ox and sturdy mule, so working the fields. So this is something in terms of mixture. Mostly people talk about oxen when they talk about transport in the ancient world. So we actually have to put the mule in there from the 8th century onwards. So it's quite neat. So we've got a neat dating point. Now I want to talk to you about mule racing at Olympia because it's such fun. It's so interesting that because Pindar's at Olympians, we have 2 examples of mule racing. We're talking about victors, so from 460, 456, 472, or 468, and we will talk about the coin with the hair on it. And now, these 2 people, they are from Sicily. They are tyrants of Sicily. Certainly Haggius was. And this is taking part in mule racing. Now, the image is to help us imagine mule racing, because that's definitely not a horse. The legs are too big for a coiny representation of a horse, and the body is too fat. So again, they've got chariot racing at Olympia, fine, but mule racing. Now, where the people are coming from, Syracuse and Camarina in Magna Graecia, Sicily, and we have very neatly, Pausanias gives us a range 50-year period in which mule racing was taking place. Now, Olympia is in Arcadia, which, if you've read Barrow on mule breeding, who has his own mule stud farm, you probably haven't, but he says the best ones are from Rieti and Arcadia, so mountainous areas to harden the hooves of mules. Now, the races for mule carts and the trotting race were instituted respectively at the 70th festival and the 71st. Which one? I went for the last one. But we have this short period where they stopped doing it. Now, if you stop doing something at the Olympic Games, you're doing that because it's no longer interesting. There's a sense where mule races, when they were introduced, have a spectacle to them. But when you stop having them, they're no longer interesting. So the 5th century, we might say that this 50-year period might be an indication of a fundamental change in the use of mules. So something which is a novelty and then is not a novelty. Now, this guy, Anaxilas, minted some coins with a mule racing device on, and he's also the person who's said to introduce hares into Sicily. So if we're thinking about this idea of multi-species change, and this is one of those things which he said, Pollux in the Onomasticon reports, Aristotle says it, so whether it's true or not, it doesn't really matter. We do find the introduction of species can go wrong, particularly there's the example of the Balearic Islands of Ibiza, Majorca, and Minorca. Under the Emperor Augustus, they wrote to Augustus, could we have some soldiers because we've been overwhelmed by rabbits? Our island, we're starving because of the rabbits. So it's amazing what's in Pliny. It's always just like, I thought, okay, I better look up hares, having found this. Let's have a look at Pliny. And you suddenly go, okay, that's really interesting. So mule racing also seems to appear on vases in the 5th and 6th century, so a bit earlier than the introduction into the Olympic Games. And we have, this one is a Chalcidian vase, and the other one, which is, I haven't found this one yet, but it's a rather, the drawing of the mule is rather charming. They're definitely not horses. These are too chunky to be horses. Now, one thing, mule use, and if we start looking through sort of Greek world of who gets to ride a mule in mythology, well, Hephaestus does, of course, because he's lame. Silenus does because he's drunk. Well, Hephaestus is also drunk. So being incapacitated, and you may know this, probably a rhetorical exercise by Lysias, about the accusation of a person who is said to be disabled and gets a stipend, but they say he shouldn't have one. on the grounds that he's been riding horses. And the man says, well, if I had lots of money, I would have a mule to ride on. So the idea that you're riding horses rather than a mule is a suggestion that you are able-bodied. But he says, well, I borrowed the horses from my friends. But it doesn't so much matter, but the idea of the mule helping with mobility for those who have a mobility impairment is one of those things which we have in Greek culture. Now, we're going to go to Assyria, to Nineveh, modern Mosul, which was in the news a lot when ISIS were doing dreadful things to people. But this was roughly, we're going to look at something from about 700 BCE, a set of images. Nineveh, in about 700 BCE, was the largest city in the ancient world. It's on the Euphrates. And the thing we're going to look at is the thing which caused me probably to be an ancient historian, which are these friezes in the British Museum. Now, Assyrian culture is one of those ancient cultures which is very good at concentrating populations. So it captures lots of slaves and moves them to the place of concentration. So here are some people who's been captured. In the upper register, there are some clerks doing the accountancy, and there is everything in this. So we just want to go through this just to see 700 BCE, what forms of transport. So we've got some oxen probably captured as well, which is the other thing which the Assyrians represent capture by in terms of taking the goats away, taking stuff away, concentrating population change, is what they are really good at, just as the Roman Empire is good at that. And we have this cart with this very strange looking mule. I think we can say that it's a mule. They've made the drawing to make it look extra big. So we have ox carts, we have mule, and a very big wheel as well. So the idea of size of the cart is bigger. And in contrast, we have horses. Here's the king. He's just like quietly, quite nicely. But then we also have quarry scenes. So human labor. There's lots of, in terms of human carrying of stuff. And rather than having animals pull carts, there is sufficient human labor to have humans pull carts. But it might suggest that they haven't got loads of animals. I'm using human labor for pulling carts is something which in early colonial New South Wales was a big thing in terms of convicts pulling carts because they did not have any horses, mules, donkeys, etc. So this might be a suggestion that in 700 BCE, yes, they've got mules, they've got oxen, but they're also using human labor to pull carts, which are quite large structures. And in terms of pulling, this is a scene of pulling one of those large bulls into the city. We're from about 50 kilometers away, where you have that image which we see with pyramid building in children's books, thousands of people pulling large blocks of stone. So this is really sort of in terms of they've got lots of human labor, and humans may be better at some forms of movement. And we have another ox cart. These are fantastic things in terms of inspiration for wanting to study the ancient world. I was about 7 years old. And there is a camel. Just to include it, I was delighted because I remembered these and I thought there were images of transport in them, but I hadn't seen them for about 20 years. I went to the British Museum in August and going, yeah, definitely, covers absolutely everything. So those multiple different forms of transport in 700 BCE in Nineveh suggests that, I mean, you could say it's artistic representation, but let's not. Let's say that this gives us a snapshot into a world where we haven't really got very much evidence. So we will leave there and we will go into the wider Mediterranean. So that gives us several points in all of this, because the donkeys are moving from this part of the world, camels are moving from this part of the world westwards. Now, this graph is quite famous. It may not be famous to everybody, but this is a graph of shipwrecks. We've had a graph of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean probably since the 1980s when somebody made it for the first time. And what it shows us is there are far more shipwrecks found in the Roman Empire than any other period. If we're thinking of where we were in 700 BCE, at the time of Nineveh, there is far less stuff moving indicated by shipwrecks. And it's kind of a remarkable graph. It's a graph which has been with us. It has a dip after 250 BCE, which is really interesting. But it gives us a context if we're going to talk about mobility on land. I'm not going to talk about ships because I don't find them very interesting. Now, we're going to go to probably the area which has had the most intensive field surveying done on it, which is the Roman hinterlands. On the right-hand side, you can see the major roads coming out of Rome going north and south. And you've also got the geology, which is the volcanics. And the red stuff is lava, which is what the Romans make their paving stones from. Another area of my work includes provenancing of paving stones using portable XRF, but you can go and find that on the website. Now, the map on the left shows where the field surveys have been done. Now, field surveys have been done in the Tiber Valley since the 1950s to discover sites, and also to pick up pottery. Now, what has happened is there's been a linking of all of that data together recently in the Roman Hinterlands project, and its potential to start seeing very, very large patterns of change. Now, let's just take a look at Amphory for the sake of it. So Peter Atema, to get the Flemish pronunciation, probably Dutch pronunciation correct, has been instrumental in pulling this together with other colleagues. So there's et al. Because there's about 10 more people. So Amphory sherds have been picked up for decades, so 60 years of study. 3,391 of them are dated, which is a lot relatively, but it's not a lot if you're going to see the big picture. And it allows us to have a graph, because these are mostly imported wine amphorae. They are associated with movement. And we have a rather nice graph here where, once again, just like the shipwrecks, we have a peak during the Roman Empire, and we have a little peak and then a dip, and then another dip at the end of the Roman Republic, which gives us an idea of what may be changing. So if we're thinking to move all these amphorae around, so if we think this is indicative of the number of places, the amount of mobility, we are having a massive mobility change and a massive mobility decline at the end of the Roman Empire, just as we did with the shipwreck. So we're starting to see things which are related, but not normally related to one another. Now, this is a graph where if we look at the bars rather than the pottery, these are the sites which the Tiber Valley project has established. So if we're sort of thinking this through, so normally when we talk about archaeological sites, we see them as static things. We see them as evidence of settlement, and settlement is the opposite of mobility in a lot of archaeological thinking. There's a thought that you'll be doing your farm all by yourself type thing. But if we see sites as about movement, because people have got to go somewhere and start a site. So if we start, so roughly 820 BCE, we then have an explosion of sites in about the 8th century, about the time of Homer, about the time of our mules in the Iliad. And then we have a decline in the 5th century, something happens, and then we have an increase in the 4th century, then we have a decline in the 3rd century, and then we have a gradual increase, and then we have an explosion in the late Republic and early Empire. Now, if we see this as indicative, because the way it's written is about there were these sites, there were more sites, there were less sites, but if we see this as an indication, if you have more sites, you need more mobility. So we can see this as potentially proxy evidence for mobility, just as the shipwrecks are proxy evidence for sea mobility. Now, if we think about the camel chronology, which has been put ahead by Evelyn Todd and about 50 other people in this article, we might be able to start seeing a bit of sense around this in terms of they don't relate things particularly to settlement sites because they can't see into archaeology. So they might relate things to, at the time of the Roman Republic, right? Very much so about political history. But if we relate it to settlement chronologies, Tarquinia, 800 to 500 BCE, getting very definitely have got examples of mule bones, of mules and donkeys. So that fits with our graph quite nicely. So we're not going to say that it fits perfectly because there aren't enough examples in their study, but it gives us a way to start thinking about it. Now, you can relate this to other things. So the dating of, for instance, lead pollution from Greenland. These are always related to political periods, but if we relate them to the spread of donkeys, because if you're going to make more metal, you need to move the stuff around and you need to move the stuff for use. So again, we might see this data as proxy for mobility as well, rather than for what it's been read off as. And we can also do copper. This is a graph which has been kicking around for some time. But the idea of relating everything, the introduction to coinage causes the need for an increase in metal, but you can't, what's the point of coinage if you don't have a mobility? Because coinage is about mobility. The greatest change in terms of the mobility of for the Roman Empire is when Augustus has gold coins. If you have gold coins, you do not have to take 70 kilos of silver with you to have 1 million sesterces. Or tons and tons. 70 kilos of gold is 1 million sesterces, which you can put on the back of the nice animal there, which is carrying bricks. So in this concept of using metals, the use of metals and mobility need to be related together. And you can't really do it. The other thing you can't really do is you can't really have a Roman army without a load of donkeys and mules. It's estimated, and this is in the old book from 1999, because I reread it yesterday on the train, because I was going, maybe I should read what I actually said. One of the things in that, there is a calculation of how many mules and donkeys does a Roman army. The sources say they use mules, so they're bigger, greater carrying capacity. They expect 1,500 per legion. So if we see a legion of 6,000 soldiers, 5,000 soldiers, 1,500 donkeys, you've also got the problem of resupply because donkeys die. So you start needing a secure supply. And this is where we start wondering about that peak in the Roman Empire, that sort of the peak in the graph. What does that do to the basic supply of mobility? What does it do? Does it put pressure on the breeding of donkeys and mules? Can we get any evidence for that? Now, just to show these two graphs next to each other, just to show where they have similarity and where they have difference. Now, there is a bias in the shipwrecks. The bias in the shipwrecks is a lot of underwater archaeology in the south of France and Italy is much more advanced than the Eastern Mediterranean, let alone along the African coast. So there's an inherent bias in that. Now, we can see a dip in exactly the same place in the dating range, and we can see very obvious peak. People can always see peaks, they can't see dips on graphs. So that gives us some correlation between the two. Correlation isn't an explanation though, but it just gives us an idea of using settlement evidence as evidence for mobility. Now, the possibility of proliferation of donkeys, one of the things, the map on the right-hand side is everywhere where they found paving stones. It's the black dots. This is a volcanic region. Not surprisingly, they built road surfaces absolutely everywhere in a way which is quite different to other parts of Italy. But if we're going to think about proliferation of donkeys and mules over time, so going from Iliad, it seems that donkeys are quite a rare, mules are a rare thing. We don't know anything about donkeys from Iliad. And this is where we're going to start talking about camels. Now, this is Jacopo, who's now died, unfortunately. I spent a week in Japan with Jacopo where we had conferences because Japanese academics have to be in their university Monday to Friday and can only have conferences the weekend. So Jacopo and myself and two of his colleagues had very little to do for 5 days apart from enjoy ourselves. But Jacopo explained to me about his work on donkeys. Now, he collated in a publication, which, as you can see, we all go and read archaeological studies in honor of Alfredo. He's buried it, basically. It's on his academia webpage. And he collated evidence in Italy and in Europe for camel bones. Very, very simple. So this rather lovely inscription, which is to somebody who's a praepositus camelorum in Ostia Antiqua. And at the bottom of the inscription, you can probably see some wild animals in there. The image on the left-hand side is from Herculaneum. It seems that looks like a camel to me. They did not have llamas. So the dating, 1200 BCE, domestication, proliferation in Egypt from 500 BCE. It's actually a slow process. The Ptolemies, Alexander has the use of camels. The Persians have the use of camels. Greek comedy knows about camels. But in Italy, the evidence is from about 60 AD. So that time where we see lots of mobility and so there may be a sort of desperation. What can we use? And the importing of camels seems to be present. Jacopo evidence very carefully goes through that the camel was in Europe in the medieval period, which Sasha would be delighted by. Also, that if you look in the Journal of Archaeological Science, more camel bones are found regularly on the Danube frontiers in Hungary, for example, on a routine basis. So now people are looking for camel bones, you can find them. But this study from 2006 really initiated that. And I was just very lucky to spend time with Jacopo. Now, why import them? Now, there is a basic thing in terms of loading. And here we can sort of start thinking about advantages of breeding mules. Why breed mules? Because they are much, much stronger than donkeys. A dromedary is, again, able to take a much larger load. They can go further per day and they live for longer. I think dromedaries live for 50 years. I think mules, 25 years, horses, 12 years. And what they're also doing, and there is evidence for this by the 3rd century AD, they're crossing dromedaries with Bactrian, the double-humped camels, to produce the super camels. If you look up on the internet, it is quite interesting, camel wrestling. These are the super camels. So just as they crossed a donkey with a mule to make donkey with a horse to make a mule, they're crossing dromedaries with Bactrian camels to make a stronger animal again. And now, Greek sources about camels, I did a quick search. Aristophanes' joke about the arse of a camel seems to have the audience in stitches. But Herodotus says, I do not describe the camel's appearance to Greeks, for they know it. Simple as that. They know what a camel is. So camels are known by the time of Herodotus. And at the Battle of Thermopylae, he lists the Arabian camel riders. So very specific Libyan charioteers. There's sort of that ethnicity in camels goes together. And Xenophon, we can find. You start looking for things, you find them everywhere. Now, the spread of the genome associated with camels, there seem to be several different types. And the blue really shows that spread in antiquity from Arabia along the North African coast through the Sahara and ultimately down into West Africa. So, and that trading route, the caravan route, now, unfortunately, this study hasn't looked at the camel bones in Europe because they didn't know about them. So one of the things which we're missing here is we're missing a load of evidence. But by late antiquity, this spread has happened. So if we're thinking 2500 BCE when we started, none of that was possible. Only after about 500 BCE, we see it in Egypt, the spread of camels, and then by late antiquity, certainly the spread through to West Africa, and that thing which we kind of normalize, we associate as Europeans, we're deeply Oriental about camels. We see them as deeply not European, but they're in Europe right through to the Renaissance. So, and then they disappear for reasons totally unknown. Okay, we've got some conclusions, hopefully. So if we're thinking about multi-species mobility, multi-species mobility can be described as the migration of things westwards. Now, if we're thinking of change in the ancient world, migration of things westwards is perfectly normal. Basically, money is taken by Macedonia from the Persian Empire and moved westwards. Rome takes it from Macedonia, it moves westwards. There's a westward movement of people, there's a westward movement of animals as well. Now, improved breeds clearly are happening. Mules, we have them in Homer. We seem to see that as a point. It's kind of confirmed by the stuff in Nineveh. And we might actually start thinking all of that architecture, which if you're thinking of classical architecture, if you've ever taught a course on classical architecture, if you start thinking of that less in terms of the architecture and in terms of the mobility to create it, there is Janet Delane's study of the Baths of Caracalla, which entirely depends on ox carts for its calculations. So if you move away from ox carts, you actually get a different answer. Now, the supply of donkeys and mules can be subject to variability or disruption. It's not sort of a given. And I think I've been lucky enough to supervise a thesis by Judy Simpson on zoonoses, which the examiners, fingers crossed, will actually say it's lovely. But one of the things she talks about is things like cattle plagues which can affect animals, can wipe out your animals. The ancients have a concept of contagion with reference to animals and what might be called beasts or herds. And the idea of isolating the animal which is sick from everybody else is in their thinking, which they seem to have trouble transferring into the human world. Now, if we're thinking about domestication of the camel and its migration to Africa and Europe, now this phenomenon of itself is not a natural phenomenon. It's something which you can see the utility of camels in desert regions, but you can't necessarily see the utility of camels in temperate regions. There is a thought in the heads of ancient authors that places like the Black Sea are too cold for donkeys and mules. It's thought now that the donkeys which you can find in the Shetland Islands at the north of Scotland probably came with the Roman period. So this idea of change and major change in terms of the availability of animals may sit quite nicely with my other subject, which is the history of cities. So if we see the history of cities as dependent on mobility, we start thinking about multi-species mobilities rather than cities just being about humans and the built environment. That's basically where we stop.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I throw the floor open to questions. And I might leap in first, if I may, because I am absolutely fascinated by that first quote from Homer that you showed, and it's brilliant because. But I'm confused about an element of it, which is on one hand he's saying, as a measure of distance, right? The difference between how far an ox can plow and a mule can plow, which implies that how far an ox can plow and a mule can plow, right? Because otherwise that distance is meaningless. But then in the next line, he's going, and oh, by the way, and the reason I'm using this measurement is because one plows faster than the other, which implies that maybe you're not familiar with that. So what's happening there?
I mean, it's extraordinary because the furrow. I mean, it's the last thing you expect in epic poetry is to find how big a furrow is plowed by a mule and an ox. I haven't looked up commentaries on Homer to see if anyone has said anything sensible about this, but it is extraordinary. And then it's sort of, for mules can plow fallow land quicker. I mean, it's also about bringing land into cultivation, which is also a sort of the spread of things like agriculture, improvement of agriculture is, I mean, a mule is an improved breed inherently, but it kind of, it just simply doesn't make sense.
You can kind of imagine an audience hearing this recited would have farmers in the audience and perhaps they're like, oh yeah, of course, And then there's the explanation for the urban crowd who might not understand it. I mean, it's sort of.
But quicker. So it's quicker because the furrow is wider.
Yeah.
That's the
right.
that's the implication. You don't have to go up and down quite so much. How? I mean, is the plow bigger or what?
But is it the width or the length? Because it doesn't specifically say width there, does it?
No.
So it might be that the furrow is longer over the same period, but surely that would be defined by the size of the field.
I'm now going to say I don't know. I'll cease to be able to understand this.
It's really interesting. It's an absolutely fascinating example.
It is fascinating because it's so surprising. I mean, it's the last thing. I'm going to look up all these references to mules, and I've seen all the ones about boxing, and then you're like, oh, let's have a look at this. Oh my God, that is so totally surprising.
Absolutely. Nancy.
Thanks so much. I'm an animal historian, and it's just really interesting to have it projected into the ancient world, which is not an area that I'm terribly familiar with. Just on that idea of measuring space by how much could be ploughed. The quarter-acre block in Australia is supposed to go back to the amount of land that a man and a single horse could plough in one day. So it continues as a kind of a measure that some people would be familiar with. So you said at the beginning that one of the things you were interested in was animal agency in all of this, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about where you felt the animals were demonstrating agency in this. Your first question about the camels and when they were domesticated. I wanted to be cheeky and say, did they domesticate themselves? And, there are some discussions around certain species of animals that they sort of look over the fence and say, yeah, I want to get what they're growing there, and I'm going to hang out with these people, or I'm going to eat their waste products, or whatever it is. So yeah, were there any points along the way where you really felt like it's animal led, some of the phenomena that you've been exploring?
I think the camels, and I think the change from hunting camels for meat to domestication. I mean, what would the camel want? I mean, this is sort of going. If you're domesticated, they look after you, or you can be hunted by them. I mean, that in terms of the human interaction, it's sort of you can get terribly functional about this and sort of think it's a no-brainer. But I don't think that particularly helps. We kind of lost sight of animal agency, but certainly I think the spread of the camel tends to be, we have to say that there is something going on there. because we have to say this animal which is completely unfamiliar in the West becomes synonymous with the West in terms of the North African shore is basically camel dominated by late antiquities. So that ability to have change through interaction with humans, I think that I would put some agency in there. I wouldn't be able to prove it.
I just think of some of the examples in Australia, and you did refer to the camels in Australia a couple of times, about how the saddles that were imported with them were stuffed with various grasses and so on. And when they were flattened out and they needed to be refilled, the cameleers just threw all of the bits and pieces of plant material wherever they were along the routes that they were using. And that created whole new plant communities along those routes, which were things that were much more familiar to the camels. So in some ways they're creating a more familiar environment for themselves. And also the camel pads and the way that where they walked became very beaten down. And then that was a track that could be used by many other species, including humans. When they started riding bicycles, the camel pads were a nice smooth track that you could ride a bicycle along. So yeah, I'd be really interested if there's anything like that.
I think
come across in the ancient world.
And there's a great article about how the material culture of changes by using a camel rather than a donkey, because you can take bigger tents. So the whole, in terms of movement and amount of time you can spend in desert environments, increases simply through camel usage. Not that they're giving up on donkeys, because they use donkeys and camels together, but it is quite clear that they can carry more stuff and they can have more elaborate tents, and which actually affects the sort of whole archaeology, and also affects how humans use a wider range of parts of Egypt, for example. It becomes easier to use and have longer stopping. You can keep going for longer over time because of the humpiness of camels.
Thank you.
Rebecca.
That was brilliant. Thank you. I was just really curious actually about the changeover for where mules became more common and more accepted, rather than back at this period where it was all these are prizes and these are wonderful important things that you're showing off. One of the things that I'm looking at is the use of magic and animals in magic. It was something I looked at a little while ago, and mules in around the 5th century BC onwards, very, very popular in magic. Donkeys were more popular, used a lot more often, but horses non-existent. And the main thinking is that because you don't use the horse is far too expensive to be cut up and used in potions. Whereas the mule at that point in time is apparently okay to do so. So I find it quite interesting they had this sort of higher level period of these are amazing prizes for everyone that you wouldn't go and cut this up sort of thing. Yeah, no,
I think the fascination is that by the Roman period, we have, Varro talks about this in great depth in the Res Rusticae, and because he's got a breeding stud farm, and so the breeding of horses for the circus is one thing, the breeding of mules for carriages, and then he also says, well, the poor man can't afford a mule. So the idea of there are still levels of supply in this. Matching mules being very expensive in the Roman period is completely true. There are lots of portents to do with mules giving birth throughout Livy, which might actually parallel some of your 5th century stuff from the Greek world. So that so if you're thinking about sort of magical things and portents are kind of the same type of knowledge. But Livy is quite obsessed by portents, particularly or the birth of a 3-legged mule being a poor sign. But mules and donkeys aren't sacrificial animals in the Roman world, which is also interesting.
Other questions?
Well, could I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it, Jade.
I was just thinking while you were talking about camels, what about elephants? Because we know they made an entry into Rome, sort of in the Republic at least. We have people using them for chariots and whatever.
Yeah, so I think elephants, the war elephant comes to Italy in the 3rd century BCE. It comes across with the Macedonian army. The knowledge of elephants is actually much more as a spectacle, and ultimately the North African forest elephant is hunted out of existence by the Romans. And Pliny talks about the use of ivory, but he doesn't really see them as transport animals. He sees them as war animals, or as things to fight in the arena, or things to draw your triumphal chariot to make you look better. There's a lovely coin, which I haven't got an image with me today, but there's coins of Octavian which commemorate road building. And the commemoration of road building, it has a bridge, and it also has a triumphal arch on it. And on the triumphal arch, to start off with, is an elephant-drawn chariot. So again, but it's to do with road building. So putting these triumphal arches at the start and end of Roman roads is quite a thing. So that's probably a connection to elephants as these things which they don't see on a daily basis. They're not sort of familiar with them as things for transport, particularly. So I don't think so, although having said that, I think I can go and have another look, because quite often when you say, I don't think that's the case, and you haven't looked, mules in the Iliad, anything is possible. So because, and I think this is sort of something which is very true of the study of antiquity. We think we know about antiquity, but if we then go and look for something which we wouldn't look for naturally, because elephants and transport, well, let's go and have a look and we might find something. We still haven't completely data mined all those Greek and Roman texts completely to have them at our fingertips. We think we know them, but we actually don't know them. So they're familiar, but then we can find strange things crop up which are completely unexpected.
Can I ask another question? Sorry to push on. It's about the feeding of these animals. Was this a limitation on the sort of movement and growth of packs and whatever happens? Because it's, you know, they just can't graze all the time. And if you've got, for example, moving with the Roman legion, 1,500, was it 1,500 mules? The feeding of those mules it's clearly a huge logistical problem. So is there any sort of study on the relationship between, you know, feeding and sort of movement or expansion, domestication, all of that sort of stuff?
No, nothing. Not a thing.
Nothing.
Nothing's been done. If you want to do some work, please go ahead. There is, I mean, the Roman roads have inns where you can change horses as an organized thing by the Roman state. And that is something which is set up for the transport of soldiers, the proconsul, or imperial freedmen. It's not for everybody. It's actually for the mechanism of the state. So these very, very small mentiones, and quite a lot of those are almost militarized, so that you have an organization by the state to organize its own transport and to prioritize its own transport over everybody else's. So in that sense, they're aware that if they don't have animals for state transport, they don't really have a state. But for everybody else, we're don't know. No idea.
Okay. Thank you.
But it is interesting to note there, Jane, that the trajectory that Ray's been telling us about, from horse, donkey, mule to camel, those are, you're going from animals that require a lot of food and water, regular times and regular amounts, to the camel, which can go for long periods without drinking or eating terribly much, and is more versatile in what it will eat. So there could be something there for someone to do some research on.
Yeah. Let alone oxen, which are hugely inefficient. It's like they have 7 stomachs.
All righty, we are coming up to, we have slightly exceeded the end of the hour, so please join me in thanking Ray again for an absolutely fascinating paper. Just before you go, a quick note that firstly that the recording of this paper will be released next week as part of New South Wales History Week. And secondly, our next paper will be on Tuesday, the 10th of September. Tuesday, not Monday. Got that one wrong. Tuesday, the 10th of September at 9 a.m. and will be online only. And our presenter, who is co-hosted by the Centre for the Study of Violence, will be Omer Bartov, speaking on the topic the Never Again Syndrome, Uses and Misuses of Holocaust Memory in Contemporary Global Politics. And we hope to see you then.